that collect data and information from primary and secondary sources, IoT, explain how the Homestead Act and the Transcontinental Railroad impacted the settlement of the West. Collect data to bring together facts in one place. Explain to make something clear by describing it in detail. Impacted, strongly affected. Performance-based objective, US.01. Students will develop an understanding of these Tier 3 words during the lesson. Homestead Act. Transcontinental Railroad.
Range comes to a close. Open-range ranching flourished for more than a decade after the Civil War. During that time, several million cattle were driven from Texas north to railroad stops in Wyoming, Nebraska, and Kansas. However, by the mid-1880s, the heyday of open-range ranching came to an end. Several factors contributed to the demise of the open range. The invention of barbed wire made it possible to fence in huge tracts of land on the treeless plains. The supply of beef exceeded demand, and the price of beef dropped sharply. Added to these factors was a period of extreme weather in the 1880s, brutally freezing winters followed by summer droughts. As springs dried up, herds of cattle starved. The nature of cattle ranching changed as ranchers began to raise hay to feed their stock, and farmers and sheepherders settled on what had been open range. Check understanding. How did the railroad affect the cattle industry?
The Great Plains, conquered by steel and steam. The Transcontinental Railroad threads a thin line of civilization through the wilderness. People follow. In just 1 year, 40,000 settlers moved to Nebraska, fanning out across the frontier in wagon trains.
When in the mid-19th century to the late 19th century, they went out and settled some hostile territory known to mankind in the Great Plains where I grew up. These were true pioneers.
The government accelerates the process with the greatest land giveaway in history. Anyone with a $10 filing fee can claim free land. A quarter are single women and ex-slaves.
When you see the desperate scramble in these rickety wagon trains, you realize that the promise of America was land. These are people who never in a million years would be able to own land in Europe.
Eventually, 10% of the United States will be given away under the Homestead Act.
I'm not going back to Indiana to rent until I bust entirely and have to walk back.
Uriah Oblinger, Civil War vet, claims his 160 acres in Nebraska. There's a catch. 110-degree summers spark prairie fires. Trees can't survive the drought and flames. There's so little rain, nothing grows here but grass. Without lumber to build houses, the new inhabitants live in mud huts, built of sod, cut from the plains. Uriah dismantles his wagon to make doors and windows.
They often had insects. They invited snakes. It was, well, pretty much like living in a burrow in the ground.
I think the pioneers did have it hard. They conserved, they were frugal. The one dress lasted a long, long time.
For Uriah's wife, Maddie, it's a price worth paying.
I expect you think we live miserable because we are in a sod house. But I tell you in solid earnest, I never enjoyed myself better. Every lick we strike is for ourselves, and not half for someone else.
The devout Oblingers face daily tests of their faith. With no mountains to stop the wind, the Great Plains are a breeding ground for massive thunderstorms.
The most objection I have to the weather here is the wind. There's a great deal of it during winter and spring, and being nothing to break it, One feels it more.
Don't go too far, honey.
The Oblingers live in Tornado Alley. More twisters hit this region than anywhere else on Earth. Over 400 touch down every year.
Tell the folks they never seen a storm in Indiana. Only playthings.
200-mile-an-hour winds spin into a vortex, sucking in air and anything not bolted down. In 1930, a man is carried a mile across Kansas. Fish and toads rain from the sky. The Oblingers hunker down in their heavy sod house, clinging to their newfound independence.
I think that we're a nation of people descended from tough old coots and tough old broads. And I say that with great admiration. They just wanted to control their own future and to have children who could control their own destiny.
Farmers settle the plains. The Great Plains were the last part of the country to be heavily settled by white people. The region was originally set aside for Indians because it was viewed as too dry for agriculture. Yet, with the coming of the Transcontinental Railroad, millions of farmers moved into the West in the last huge westward migration of European Americans in the mid to late 1800s. The push and pull factors that encouraged settlement were varied. Like the miners and cattle ranchers, farmers were looking for a better life. Railroads advertised land for sale, even sending agents to Europe to lure new immigrants, especially from Scandinavia. Other immigrants fled political upheavals in their native lands. Westward migration and settlement. Throughout its history, the nation's westward expansion had been marked by migrants settling on public land they did not own. These settlers, called squatters, pressured the government to allow them to gain ownership of this land. In 1841, Congress passed the Preemption Act, giving squatters the right to buy up to 160 acres for $1.25 per acre before the land was offered for sale to other buyers. This law set the stage for the Homestead Act, passed in 1862. Under the Homestead Act, the government offered farm plots of 160 acres to anyone willing to live on the land for 5 years, dig a well, and build a road. These two laws encouraged further settlement and farming in the West, eventually leading to the close of the frontier. Opportunities in the West such as mining and cattle herding were generally male occupations, so much of the Western migration was led by men. But as farming expanded, more women arrived, too. They all had a job to do, such as tending the family and farm or working as an entrepreneur running a boarding house, laundry, or bakery. Some of the new settlers were former slaves who fled the South after the end of Reconstruction. Benjamin Singleton, a black businessman from Tennessee, helped organize a group of African Americans called the Exodusters. They took their name from the biblical story of Moses leading the exodus of the Jews out of bondage and into a new life in the Promised Land. The Exodusters' Promised Land was in Kansas and Oklahoma, where they planted crops and founded several enduring all-black towns.
The Great Plains is also home to the most numerous species of large wild mammal on Earth. 30 million buffalo. Herds up to 25 miles long race to summer breeding grounds. On a collision course with the modern world. The railroad brings a new kind of hunter to the Great Plains. Driven by profit. Fresh from the carnage of the Civil War. $2 million rifles are in circulation. Over 1 million veterans trained to use them have a new target in their sights. Frank Mayer, Civil War vet, buffalo hunter.
I had nothing to look forward to in civilization. I was crazy about guns.
Mayer tracks 2,000-pound buffalo, easily capable of crushing a man. He picks them off from 200 yards.
If you could kill them, what they brought was yours. They were walking gold pieces.
Hunters harvest the buffalo for its hide. In 1872, they shipped over 1 million out of Kansas alone, worth $3 a piece back east. On a good day, Mayer earns more than the president. Factories use long strips of buffalo leather as drive belts. Small pieces become coats and shoes. To meet demand, hunters kill 8,000 buffalo a day for their hides alone.
For Americans, this is progress because this is a natural resource. From the Indian perspective, they couldn't understand what the white people were doing. But of course, they knew that the decimation of those buffalo herds would change their lives forever.
The Plains Indians depend on the buffalo and worship them.
The buffalo were our strength, from whence we came, and at whose breast we suck as babies all our lives.
Black Elk is 6 years old when the railroad arrives. Unlike the white hunters, his people waste none of their kill. Sinews become bowstrings. Bones are cups and spoons. Skin is clothing, teepees, and coffins. Native Americans and buffalo have coexisted since the last ice age. Black Elk's ancestors hunted them on foot. There were no horses to ride. The modern horse isn't native to North America. Spanish conquistadors brought them from Europe in 1493. Some escaped to the Great Plains, perfect horse habitat. 400 years later, over 1 million Mustangs run wild. Taming horses transforms the life of the Plains Indian. They become expert horsemen.
The battle cry went up, "Hookah!" which means to charge, and the hunters went in for the kill.
On horseback, the bow is the weapon of choice. In the time it takes to reload a gun, a warrior can ride 300 yards and fire 20 arrows. Buffalo can run at 35 miles an hour. Hunts cover hundreds of miles over many days. It can take 15 arrows to kill a buffalo. White hunters like Frank Mayer use a single cartridge. He aims for the lungs. A clean kill drops a buffalo without disturbing the herd. $30 million are killed in little over a decade. After hunters take the hides, trainloads of men arrive to pick their carcasses. They make buttons from bones and grind down skeletons for fertilizer and porcelain. The primary resource keeping Native Americans alive is gone. Facing starvation, they're forced onto reservations.
My great-great-grandmother, Grandma Big Eagle, was alive when buffalo hunting ended. they weren't just saying goodbye to a kind of a foodstuff. They were saying goodbye to a way of being in the world. And I think for them to look back on that was just unspeakably sad.
In 1889, just 85 wild buffalo exist in the whole United States. The men who ride the great iron horse are taming the wilderness.
Homesteading the plains. Physical and human geographic factors made the lives of homesteaders on the plains difficult. Windstorms, blizzards, droughts, plagues of locusts, and heart-rending loneliness tested their endurance. On the treeless plains, few new arrivals could afford to buy lumber to build a home. Instead, they cut 3-foot sections of sod and stacked them like bricks, leaving space for a door and one window. The resulting home was dark, dirty, and dingy. Necessity is the mother of invention, and farmers on the plains had many needs beyond housing. The development of barbed wire, a length of wire with twisted barbs, enabled a farmer to fence land cheaply to keep out wandering livestock. The development of a plow that could tackle the sod-covered land, the grain drill that opened furrows and planted seed, the windmill that tapped underground water, and dry farming techniques were some of the innovations that enabled farmers to succeed. To spur development of better ways to farm, Congress passed the Morrill Act in 1862, which made land grants to states for the purpose of establishing agricultural colleges. Nothing, however, prepared farmers for a series of blizzards and droughts in the 1880s and 1890s that killed animals and ruined harvests. Some of the discouraged and ill-prepared settlers headed back east. The farmers who remained became more commercial and depended more on scientific farming methods. Identify main ideas. Why did farmers move to the plains?